It's really good to see you guys this morning, and it's really great to have some vigorous exercise to get the synapses firing right before a chat. It's always nice to come up here back to Berkeley. It's been a while. Thank you, Christine, very much, of course, for inviting me. I want to just give you a brief prelude. I want to give you a couple of anecdotes. I want to talk a little bit about our time here, prior and hence. I want to talk about county and other levels of government from a 20,000-foot level, and I want to get into some more detail as well. And I want to have a really robust Q&A at the end. Also, in the middle of all that, I'd like to do a brief introduction period. And I want to learn a little bit from you. I want to engage with you a little bit and understand where you're coming from, because that'll really help me. So, I should start with what was really indelible to me, and it might be to you. I came to this school in 2009, and I came from Southern California, and I sat in a class just like yours. And on my first visit to Richmond, inside of 1 hour, I was face down, pressing my cheek to the concrete as the block I was on was being strafed by automatic gunfire. Quite an introduction to the town, right? 14 years later, I live here. I'm raising my 3 young children here with my wife, and I work here. I love this place, and I hope you will too. And I also hope that that harrowing experience, which I'll go into a little more detail later, doesn't poison your perception of Richmond, because that doesn't tell the story then. So, to understand the context and the years that pass, I always think about my favorite pre-Socratic philosopher, that'd be Heraclitus, who said, you can't always step into the same river twice, nor can you visit the same Richmond twice. Because in 2023, Richmond is significantly different, demographically, economically, socially, politically, than it was in 2009. In many ways, the transformation of Richmond is a microcosm of the transformation and the change in our country today. And it makes for not only a great community, a diverse community, a community brimming with talent and promise, but also a great place to practice this craft of journalism, especially with all the new media tools that you have available at your disposal. At that time, when I told that story about that particular place, that was on the first day of what we called multimedia boot camp that got us all ready to go with our digital tools. Do you still do that?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, the name maybe hasn't changed, but the tools certainly have, and that's obviously to your benefit. So, before I dive into issues of government and journalism that I know you're all excited to hear about, I want to hear a little bit about you. I'll start by way of introduction of myself. My name is Robert Rogers. I grew up in Southern California. I came to Berkeley in 2009 just to go to this program. It was my first visit to the area. I'd been to San Francisco as a tourist as a kid, but my wife and I at the time, we had just been married, we were newlyweds, and we moved in and we dove in with both feet. And it was the greatest experience and the greatest transformative occurrence of my life. I really applaud you for being here at this program. Not only is it a world-class program in terms of the skills that you learn and your ability to move on in this exciting profession of journalism, but it should be changing socially and culturally as well. The lessons that you learn here at Berkeley and the people, most importantly, the people you meet, interact with, this cohort, once you're going through some stuff with some people like those around you here, the fire you're all going to be going through as you learn at a rapid pace and have exciting moments, these days will never leave. These people will never leave. Everybody in my cohort, I still keep in contact with. It's a special group, it's a special program. What you go through here is going to bond you together in a really powerful way. After journalism school, I went and worked at the Contra Costa Times. Before that, I worked at the San Bernardino County Sun in San Bernardino, California, in San Bernardino County. And after I worked at the Contra Costa Times, and then in 2015, I went to work with the county supervisor. There's a story behind that as well. I never thought that I'd be going into public service. I was all about journalism, and I did it for about about 10 years, and it was the greatest 10 years of my life in many ways. But life changed, things changed, new opportunities emerged. Now, also, I should point out, a lot of the work I do in public service has quasi-journalistic aspects to it. At the very least, it has storytelling aspects to it. And I think of myself as a born storyteller. And I think you probably, most of you do too, and that's why you're here. And the good news is you'll hear a lot about people talking about how journalism is dying or whatever, which is of course not true. There is shrinkage at certain levels of the profession that reduce overall employment roles, but also can increase opportunities for those at different levels of the profession. But the market for storytelling across platforms, right? The market for storytelling across contexts, whether it's for nonprofits, whether it's for public agencies or private agencies, whether it's for cause, people who are great storytellers and master the incredible tools available to them have never had more opportunities than they have today. So that's not to say run out of journalism, go into PR, which is what I would have heard if I heard me saying this 20 years ago. It's to say that the industry and the potentials are fluid, rapidly evolving, and from where I'm sitting, very exciting. And you're part of that now because the skills that you get here are going to be extremely powerful wherever you choose to apply them. With that, before I go into the heavy duty, I'd like to hear from a few of you. Maybe it'd be good to just go in a regular order, if that's okay. How about if you tell me your name, where you're from, and what you're passionate about? Can you start here, please?
Sure. I'm Nash. I'm originally from New York.
What's the old Pulitzer phrase? Afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted? Right? That's really tremendous. That's exactly the kind of thing that I would have said when I was your age and I was in a class like this. And that's really, that's very important. That's powerful. And I think that also goes without saying that most of us, if we are in this business and we're interested about going forward in this, you have to be fearless and you have to see value in providing information that is unbiased, it's fair, it's impartial, it's not beholden to some powerful interest. Occupying that space is incredibly important for our democracy and for our social well-being, and it's also particularly the space that sometimes seems like there's a market failure around it. That's the space where who's going to pay for that, right? And I think that in the future, I think that we're at a particular nadir at that point now in not understanding the value of that impartial, unbiased information. And I think that that's going to come back with a vengeance. And I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really happy to hear that from what you just said. So, before I get into the government part, let me wrap up this. And he's having trouble. He should be here.
Yeah. Thank you, Wayne.
He said room 105 is where he was. I don't know. He has long, dark hair. We didn't want it to be all gravy and puffy cakes. We wanted to have a difficult time. Anyway, so on that story, what happened? Why am I face down? Why is there gunfire outside? Well, we were doing a feature presentation on a local restaurant called Pepito's on 23rd Street. You'll probably all see that soon enough. It's a great neighborhood in the city of Richmond. It's a real bastion of, in particular, Richmond's Latino culture. Now, it started there as a foothold of Richmond's Latino culture, but at that time, the demographics of the city were roughly thirds. 1/3 African American, 1/3 Caucasian, 1/3 Latino, Asian and Pacific Islander is there as well. Fast forward 15 years and that's changed drastically. The Anglo and the African American numbers are down, the Latino and the Asian numbers are far up. The idea that 23rd Street is this quaint little area where the Latinos have their businesses that's old hat, right? Latinos are the numerical superiority in the community as well as a political power as well. And so Latino culture in Richmond has been, Jeremy, it's good to see you. No worries. So it's really demonstrative of the demographic change that's occurred in the city over the last 14 years. We spring up after the gunfire abates. The smell of the gunpowder is already in the air. It was just feet away. A car had done a U on 23rd Street and sprayed the side of where like a burger stand and a car dealership were at the time. Andrew Melendez, welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
Really well, it's great to see you, Andrew. Thank you. Andrew will introduce himself in a bit, but he's a terrific guy. Andrew, this is the class. You missed the introductions, but they're very excited.
Thank you.
So, we were doing it in teams, tandem. My partner and I, Alex Weber, we spring up and we run to the scene. We have our cameras on, we're ready. Back then it was like a camcorder, like they called it the burrito, down in the basement of this facility. Jeremy back then was the equipment manager. Now he's a full professor, I imagine. Things have changed, of course. But we ran right to the scene. That let us know right away that we had what it took to be journalists, right? We wanted to find out what was going on. We went out there, we saw the spent shell casings. Thank God no one was hurt, right? But right away, we started running around, rounding up witnesses, getting the story. That became our multimedia presentation for multimedia boot camp, which was somewhat to the chagrin of many of the professors here, that having seen danger lurk around many of its students, and of course not wanting people to overly judge the city of Richmond based on that one isolated incident. But that incident also has a full circle narrative as well, and we might revisit that at the end. Now let's talk about government. And what really is fascinating to me and what I really enjoy is how Berkeley always brings so many international students into this space. Because international students, I feel like, really get it on a different level, really understand the fact that America, we have so much complexity, so many layers of government, that it often can turn us off, or make us feel as though there's too much, or worse yet, make us feel as though we are ineffectual. We can't get anything done because we don't know where to start. Why isn't it as simple as one person in charge of this, go to them, get it fixed? Well, the answer to that, I think, would be generally two things. Number one, if we were to rebuild the world anew, we would probably do so differently. We wouldn't have cities with ridiculous lines drawn around them and areas in the hills where there's overlap between different jurisdictions. We wouldn't do something like that. We'd probably draw the lines much better. We also might think about efficiencies in government to a greater degree. But more than anything else, it's really about, at the local level, it's about this incredible facet of decentralization of government. And we have it all the way at the federal level. We see it most pronounced there. And of course, in times of democratic crisis, we thank our lucky stars for this diversity of institutions and bodies that doesn't allow one man or one woman to have absolute rule. But the same thing is occurring at the local level. So we take the good with the bad. But overall, I do think it's a good thing. But the layers of government, understanding them, navigating them, interfacing with them, is a skill that is very difficult to acquire, takes time, and people with interests pay for it. They pay a great deal. They pay maybe for journalists to make sense of it. They pay for people to navigate it and pull the levers the way they're supposed to be pulled. And they pay for people to consult, to tell them what's going on. So what are the layers of government that govern what is around us on a daily basis? Now I can start at the presidency, the federal government, or even the state government, but I won't. Because that's not really the value that I can bring, right? bring more value, you can Google into that, and you know a lot about it already. The value I can bring to a greater degree is we're talking about the local level. So what are the government structures that really impact us at the local level? Well, we can put them into several buckets. We would say county, that's all over from large to small. County is the largest jurisdiction. And then, let me jump up above that and say intergovernmental bodies, associations. One might be something like the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Or in Southern California, there's a similar one, I think it's the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And there are others where larger government bodies across regions, they create things like MOUs and JPAs, Memorandums of Understanding, and JPAs, Joint Power Authorities, and they enter into legal agreements, kind of like treaties, and that governs the way that this supra-governmental body will govern. In the area of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, you create this thing. It was created in the 70s because there was a major problem that had to be addressed. That problem was air quality, right? Air quality, on the one hand, had a local feature to it that might have seemed too particular for the state or federal government, although, of course, their legislation is helpful as well. And yet, at the same time, too large, too regional for one city or one county to effectively tackle. So what happens is you have a major problem, in this case, air quality, pollution, and you have a need to create a new body, a new governmental body, an association, to have new ways of dealing with this problem. And so counties come together, they agree on a governance structure, a board, an executive director, they agree on a fee structure to be able to get resources from everyone, and then they agree on a scope of work, what it is we do. We see the same thing, you can think about the United Nations, or you can think about any of its bodies that exist to deal with a certain thing, whether it's hunger, or whether it's failed states, or something of that nature. These super-governmental bodies, these associations, are vitally important as well. I said we have county government, then we also have city governments, right? Then we also have special districts, and we also have school districts. What's a special district? This is a governmental body that comes together to perform one function, not regional, not something that's beyond the county per se, but to perform one particular function. A great example would be BART, the Bay Area Regional Transit Authority, right? BART creates its own government that has taxing fees, legislation, powers, and they exist in order to provide transit to the public. They have a mission statement of what they're trying to advance. They have an elected board. That elected board hires an executive director and they have staff. So these bodies, they grow often with time in their governance fees. We also have school districts, right? Tremendous, large, powerful governments that are governed by a board that is elected by people. People ask us all the time at the county office, I have to complain X, Y, or Z with my school, right? Now, we can help with consultation, explaining what's going on. We can often help in elevating their concern or constituent, bringing it to our partners, helping them with that, what we call a warm handoff, to hopefully get some resolution. But we can't snap our fingers and govern over our school district. The school district has its own independent power under state law. It has taxing power as well, it has revenue. And obviously the function that it performs affects a huge number of people in a very intimate way, where their children are going, what their children's futures will look like. We'll talk about counties for a second. Does anybody know anything here about counties in California? If so, let's hear a few things. This can vary slightly from state to state, depending on the Constitution, but the general outline is about the same. What do counties look like? Anyone?
They're big here. They're big.
Yes.
Bigger
So-
than in other places.
Yes. So, we are in Alameda County right now. Berkeley is one of the cities in Alameda County. I work in Contra Costa County. The border for Contra Costa County is just less than a couple miles this way. Contra Costa County stretches from the water all the way east to Pittsburgh and Antioch, which is pretty far. Alameda County, as you know, it includes Oakland and Livermore and many other communities. These are two of the largest counties in California. The largest county of all is LA County by a huge margin. The largest county in overall square mileage is San Bernardino County, which is bigger than more than half the states. It's a huge county. Contra Costa and Alameda are both counties of over 1 million people, which puts them in that select group of one of California's largest counties. How did counties come to exist? Counties predate cities for the most part. California is broken up into 58 counties. Each county contains a series of cities in it. There's no set number on that. And then there are areas within those counties that are not in cities. They have not been incorporated into their own cities. And so these areas are called unincorporated communities, and they are governed by the county government structure, which is different than, say, in the city of Berkeley. If we have an emergency, we call 911, we'll get the Berkeley police, and we'll get the Berkeley Fire Department to come out. On this campus, by the way, another governmental body, we'll get the Berkeley University Police. The University of California, another government structure, California State University, the community colleges, all different governmental organizations. They're super governmental bodies. So in these counties, some of them have a lot of unincorporated areas, some of them don't. Whereas in Berkeley, you'll get the Berkeley Fire and PD. In an unincorporated area, you would get the Alameda County Sheriff and the Alameda County Fire District. The same in Contra Costa. We have lots of areas like North Richmond, which is in your beat. It's a little area that's in the middle of the city of Richmond, which is fascinating. It's got its own history. That's unincorporated. They're serviced by the sheriff, the fire district. There's also communities like Kensington up here in the hills, and many others. Why did counties come into existence in the state of California, and why before cities? Well, counties came into existence for the most part in the 19th century. And in this state, that history is basically one of, think of the 49ers, right? People came west en masse, looking for their fortunes, looking for gold. And so hundreds of thousands of people are pouring into this new territory. There's a need for governmental organization to make sense of all this. You need sanitation, you need law and order, you need, here's the big one, you need records, right? And counties spring up into being for that reason. These are, again, governmental bodies existing, becoming created in order to fill a social and economic need. So in this case, in California, the big thing that counties were doing early on, can anybody guess? In those early days, what we needed when people were prospecting for gold and finding their dream homes and their dream plots, if you will? There you go. Right, mineral rights, great. And so, you're right there. That's the toehold on the whole picture, right? Land rights is huge, right? Who owns what? Who makes a claim on this land? These county governments had to create this administrative system to give us that. And we know, anyone has studied a lot in comparative politics and seen around the world, we know how important things like land rights and contract rights are, right? We know that without that, we'll have chaos. And so that's probably one of the great innovations of the 19th century across the country, was the rise of this administrative bodies to handle the mass migration of people all over this huge land. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everything was perfectly orderly all the time, right? We had sheriffs, and we had crimes, and we had people stealing one another, and it was the sense of frontier justice was not nearly as comprehensive as what we would expect today. But it was there. It also recorded things like marriages, and births, and deaths, and all that data, to the degree you can get some from the 19th century, you can pretty much thank your counties for that, right? The census, of course, exists as well, but it's administered oftentimes. You'll see this reverberating again and again when federal and state governments need to get things done at local, regional levels. they often go to the county to be their implementer, their agency to provide those services. Health is a big one. So, as time grows, what happens is all these different governmental entities grow and they have bigger and better responsibilities. Now, fast forward to today. What does our county do for us, right? This can be any county, whether it's Alameda, Contra Costa, they do the same thing. It's very simple. What do counties do today? I already said they have sheriffs, they have fire protection districts, that's nice. What else?
Land use is still one of the big things that they do.
Well, that's a good point. So it's complicated. Certainly in an unincorporated area, land use would absolutely be our province. In North Richmond, if anyone does some great research there, there's incredible work being done just north of the community or the neighborhood, where there's a series of logistics centers and warehouses that are opening that have the highest air quality standards in the country. They're really incredible, right? We mandated all electric fleets, right, by 2025. This was something that these developers and these logistics centers, they didn't want to do. It was a huge expense. But with our power over land use and our power in the sense that our constituency overwhelmingly favors this policy, we're able to enact that kind of legislation. We're able to force that investment by private industry, and we think it's the right call. Right? It's a very exciting time to be in government to do something like that. So, land use definitely governed in the unincorporated. What about the cities? The cities are going to, for the most part, they're going to be able to decide their land use, right? This is going to be residential, this is going to be commercial, and so forth. But of course, cities have to work with a whole host of governments in doing anything. The state, the federal, and the county. They have to do things like soil testing. They have to do things like meet new state mandates for density, how much housing needs to be in this or that. So there's all these different strings attached. This idea that any one government can work in a vacuum is rare. For the most part, there's a great thicket of regulations that are in place to make that land use as good as possible. Somebody who doesn't like it might call it red tape. Someone else might say that it's the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure that enables us to push back on corporate power when we need to, right? Enables us to create communities around us that can meet goals, but at the same time are representative and are the kinds of things that our constituents and our communities want. Balancing those interests, well, that's the art of government. And that's the difficult part. And it'll always be difficult, and it should be. What else do counties do?
We institute tax measures in the towns or cities that are kind of unique, like the sales tax stickers, and certain cities have to measure our fee or whatever it is, right?
Sure. Both cities and counties can introduce tax measures. There's a lot of complication about exactly what you can do when. One of the big ones is a general tax measure in the state of California requires a 2/3 vote of the public, right? That is, when I say general, that means I want to float a tax that's going to be on this or that, and it doesn't matter how we're going to use it. We're going to use it well, but we have flexibility in how we use it. To get that passed in California requires a 2/3 vote. So in other words, that's the kind of tax that a lot of people in government want, because you want that flexibility, and you want that revenue, and you think that you know how to use it best. But in its wisdom, the people of California, through the proposition measures, which are different than in many other states, they've created checks on that, and one of them is the 2/3. So, to get a 2/3 vote majority for the tax is easy or hard? Very, very hard, right? So it's very, very rare. So what they often do is they make it a special tax, so they can see that this tax will only be used for this. I can't use it for anything else. Now we don't usually love that because we say, well, things can change, we can use it for something else. But by doing that, with that concession, you're able to float that tax with a 50+1, a simple majority, which isn't easy also. very hard. How hard is it to get people to vote for a tax themselves, right? It is very difficult. That said, we did pass a tax in Contra Costa County. My boss, County Supervisor Joya, was one of the main champions of it, and it's a sales tax. And the way he got it was, it's a very small, it's a couple of pennies on the dollar, right? It goes from 9% to 9.5% or whatever. And that little tiny tax, paid by anyone who does any shopping in Contra Costa County, so a lot of revenues come from people who don't actually live here, that comes in and then it's able to be used for a variety of purposes, right? We got that passed. That was really good. Yes?
Would the special taxes have to have a sunset?
I don't believe that the sunset is required, but oftentimes it's included because it makes it, one could argue that it's good governance, and one could also definitely argue that it helps in terms of political support. Right? Like you can, it's nice to be able to say, yes, I want this tax, but after this job is done, it will go away. Right? That's a real powerful thing to say from the hustings to get people to support it. What else do counties do? Counties provide health services. This is the biggest thing that we do. Right? So when the federal government or the state government, they have mandates about what to do with funds for health. And it has to be used a certain way, it has to be provided to the communities. County governments are the ones who are doing that. The biggest, our county has a workforce of over 10,000 people. A budget of over $4 billion. The majority of that funding comes from state and federal governments that are providing it to us to perform a specific task, and oftentimes it's health and human services. That's the biggest one. So another thing that you learn in government is almost every dollar is already spoken for. The amount of leeway in the budget is very small in comparison to all of the mandates that have to be funded. So what we do with that leeway is very impactful, it's very important. People have to talk about that, we have to all discuss that. Democratic impulses being channeled into what can we do with the funds that we have agency over. But it also, we must understand in context, it's a very small amount. It's a very small amount. I learned this lesson very acutely in 2011, 2012, when I was writing for the Contra Costa Times. And Doctors Medical Center, the big county hospital in West County, was fit for closure. It simply wasn't sustainable. Why not sustainable? Well, basically, it gets funding from Medicaid and Medicare, which are always small amounts of funding in comparison to the needs that are required, right? The government doesn't give you a big blank check from the feds. You have to make do with less when you have that. And then the rise of other private payer systems in the area, like Kaiser and John Muir and others, that meant that the people who are going for health care, who are paying full price or have good insurance that are paying full price, they were going to the hospitals. And that left what was called an unsustainable payer base at Doctors Medical Center, which meant basically that Doctors Medical Center was all poor people who either didn't have insurance or relied solely on Medicaid. And so all the services that Doctors Medical Center is providing are not being reimbursed in full. So it's just losing money constantly. As a reporter, that's not good enough, right? I call a county administrator, I call every elected official, I cannot say, why aren't you saving this hospital, right? Why would you not, at a $4 billion budget, why don't you come up with the money to fund this hospital if people need it? Now, I'm not saying that that outrage or that impulse isn't right, but it doesn't take into account, it's not necessarily fair to those decision makers and what they had to deal with at the time, right? They would say, we just don't have the money. And I have a difficult time understanding how one could not have the money in this budget, right? But it is understandable when you know more. Now, it may not be totally true that it was impossible to keep the hospital open, but to do so would have absolutely required taking money from some other things and putting it in the hospital, right? Where is the discretion in the budget? There's very little. And maybe it's the social service agency, and maybe it's the sheriff's department, and maybe it's the fire department. Which one do you want to cut tremendously to come up with the millions of dollars to keep this hospital open? I don't know. hard question to answer, right? As reporters, we have to learn this. I learned this later. I didn't learn it when I was in your seat. I was all about the outrage, all about the why. And you've got to keep that. You've got to harness it. But you've also got to try to understand the bigger picture as well, right? It's not just as simple as get it done, our public service systems are failing us, or whatever. There's a more complicated story there. And it's easy for everybody to get on Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else and say, look how bad our government is going to do this. Look how bad the government is, look at the people sleeping on the street. Right? Obviously. But to truly understand this issue and the complexity and how difficult it is to challenge it and to revert the status quo, that's more complicated. That takes skill. And that adds value to the conversation. That adds value to our democratic discourse. Anything else for counties?
I have a question.
Yes.
About something that's unusual in California. I mean, I'm not sure you come upon this in Minnesota, I didn't come upon this in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. But you have a Department of Education at the county level.
That's right.
How does that differ from the school districts?
Well, that's a good question. So the county has a Department of Education. And I think maybe a good way to understand it is it's kind of similar to the federal Department of Education, right? People, they don't understand that until something shows up in the news, usually something bad, right? What does the federal Department of Education do? Well, I won't say exactly what that does, but it does something similar to what the county does, right? So the county's Department of Education, like the state's Department of Education, they tend to exist as a record-keeping function, right? A leadership and consultation function, and a sort of rule-setting function, mission-setting function, and ultimately some funding disbursement function, right? They'll get some funding from the federal or state governments, and they'll be in charge of dispersing it. What's the difference between the county Department of Education and the city's board of the city school board, name your city, school district? Well, school districts manage massive systems of schools to educate our children. The county Department of Education does not manage and run schools on its own. Right? The county Department of Education exists more in like an advisory consultation role, right? And it also implements federal mandates and disperses funds. It does it. It's an elected position. There's a county a superintendent of education, but she doesn't manage a whole menu of schools. Like, for instance, the West Contra Costa Unified School District manages all the schools in public schools and charter schools in Richmond, in El Cerrito, in Pinole, and some other areas. It's a huge school district. Los Angeles School District, biggest in the nation. Oh, interesting fact. I talked about the size of counties. LA County is so big that, and counties are governed by a board of supervisors of 5. Every county is the same. The 5 members of the board have to have a proportional representation of the same amount. John Joyer represents about 250,000 Contra Costans in West County, right? Contra Costa is divided by 5, 250 in each one, approximately. LA County, if it's 15 million people, you look at the constituency, you look at the budget, an LA County supervisor, and you probably can't name any of them, they, in terms of constituents served, budget managed, overall work scope, an LA County supervisor, you can make the argument, has more executive power than probably any Congress member, at least in the House, and many senators in smaller states. Of course, they're doing different things, but the actual size of the county government in that respect is mind-blowing, and nobody really knows who they are. It's really interesting.
Yeah, a question related to that, because in the past, LA County has had a hard time, or the supervisors have sort of operated a little bit in the dark, like they've had some oversight. Oversight is pretty weak, and I was wondering if that was a similar case in Contra Costa County, that like there's not really much, there's not an established like oversight board.
Sure. Oversight. Who is your boss? Right? I talked about the federal system, right? This fractured, decentralized system, and why that works. This incredibly complicated experiment that's full of mistakes works so well. Someone called me the other day and said, who's the board of supervisors boss? So, and then, well, is it the governor? And the answer is no. Right? The governor doesn't have any power over this directly. Who's the boss? Well, law is the boss. Right? We have to be a nation of laws. The state constitution would be a real governing document, along with obviously the federal constitution. But imagine it like this. Imagine an organizational chart. At the bottom, there is the county workforce. LA County workforce, over 100,000 people. Think about that. Incredible. County workforce. Your nurses, your doctors, your social workers, firefighters, whatever. Then above them, department heads. Right? Every department in the county has a head. Is a major executive position. Right? And in our case, we have the public works department, the fire department, they all heads. Now, most of them appointed, hired, but a few of them elected, like the sheriff, an elected position. Should that be elected? Interesting. That's a relic of the 19th century, right? Where the people elected their lawman, and it was always a man back then, to govern the use of violence in the territory. Do we want that today? I don't know. Really. Think about cities. Cities don't have elected police chief as another employee. They can be dismissed by the elected representatives. Anyway, so you have the elected, you have all the department heads, most of whom are not elected. Above that, you have the county administrator. Think of the CEO of the county, right? The manager. Who's above the manager? Who's above the county CEO? The board. That's us. A 5-member board. That CEO serves at the pleasure of the board. If 3 members of the board don't want that CEO to be the CEO anymore, they're not the CEO anymore. You hire someone new. So there's the board. That's what's governing. That's it. The board is the boss. There's the law. But there actually is another boss. Anybody think what it might be?
Lord.
Yes. You, us, people, right? So in other words, when someone says the LA County Board of Supervisors running amok, these people will only be assuming no laws are broken directly. Now there's definitely oversight of that, but LA County Board of Supervisors can do pretty much anything they want. And if you don't like it, vote it out. Right? Good and bad. I personally think it's good. I think it can open the door for leadership that leaves something to be desired. Right? We know who we are. We know now what we may be. We discover that after we have power. And a lot of us fall short. So, now let's talk briefly about Richmond. What a town. Anybody been there yet? Everybody? Great place. Now, come by our place sometime. Our office is on the east side of San Pablo, just south of the BART track, the elevated BART track, across from the Home Depot. I live right by there too. I live in Richmond. Great place. Anybody can come by anytime. I'll give you a tour of the grid. Supervisor Joy would love to meet you as well. The city of Richmond. I remember in 2012, I left for vacation. When I got back, I had the whole story laid. I missed it when it occurred, but it all happened on one beautiful day. A plume of black cloud dominated the whole Bay Area skyline. This was the worst fire at the Chevron refinery in decades. Thankfully, no one died, but that disaster was averted, just barely. The soot was all over everybody's house and everybody's cars. It was quite a spectacle. Since then, there's been a tremendous federal investigation, and they found that Chevron was negligent, and they were hit with various fines, sanctions, new rules, and so forth. But it's a fitting metaphor for Chevron's dominance in the city historically, as it has. Chevron existed here before there was a city. Right? Before the turn of the 20th century, John D. Rockefeller himself came and scouted out that bluff and said, this is a place for my oil refinery, my Standard Oil, whatever it was back then. And he planted his flag, and they built it. And now we have one of the biggest refineries on the West Coast, right here in Richmond. Now, for the first 100 years or so, that refinery dominated the city, and it was almost a benevolent dictatorship in many people's lives. But something changed in the last 20 years. A new progressive impulse rose up, and one can say that maybe Chevron's actions did or did not plant the seeds for this democratic backlash, but it's occurred. That fire was a big part of it. Right? Political leaders with impulse from the people in their communities, gaining strength, gaining power on an anti-Chevron platform. How do we regulate it more? How do we tax it more? Some people even say, how do we get it out of town? Right? That becomes a source of political power in the city where it wasn't before. And that gives rise to a whole new movement for many goods, maybe somebody say many ills. It's a mixed bag. You have to look at it in context. But it's important to understand that the installation, this refinery, if we created the world anew, it wouldn't be there. It's the most beautiful bluff in the Bay Area, whatever, right? Ill fit for a refinery or industrial operation, some might say. Certainly, I would say so. But that's the world we have. That's the world we have to govern with, right? That's what we're working toward. Chevron still pays a tremendous amount of money. It has a workforce and it has a tax rate. And those things are huge amounts of the city's budget and a smaller one of the county's budget. But that doesn't mean that the democratic backlash isn't there. And it hasn't been there. And that was what was really tapped into by that incredible 2014 class that sat right here where you are today. With that class, that was the coup de grace of the Chevron coalition. They wanted to retake the council, and they put up a tremendous amount of money with a slate of candidates to retake the city that had been bashing them for years prior under a new political coalition. And when they decided to jump in with both feet and have their political power felt in the city of Richmond, it drew attention. And it drew energy. And it started right here at this school and in this room. It started with students just like you. They said, this is the story we want to focus on. And I had the good fortune of being the lecturer and the editor-in-chief of that cohort. And I felt a little bit like a hapless guy holding a tiger by the tail, because they were great. We did a lot of stuff. And ultimately, their work, I don't want to say that it made political winners or losers, but the Chevron slate lost. And was it because of not the partisan work that they did? They didn't do any partisan work. They simply did work with campaign finance and also culture, history, and context. But campaign finance was the big one. That was where they kept making all the revelations, just by doing the old-fashioned work of going to the county registrar and getting the latest documents that were being submitted by law of our political transparency acts. So by taking that information that would have just sat there in a dusty bin otherwise, and putting it out there to the public, that generated public response. And then it drew more attention. And ultimately, our students were on shows like the Bill Moyers show. I was on the Rachel Maddow show myself, and we were featured in the LA Times. The LA Times called this class at that time the most important journalistic work being done anywhere in the country. Because I believe it was. I believe they were right. Also, to throw into that, Richmond had, the Chevron in Richmond had just launched their own competing news site called the Richmond Standard that was building influence. So you had this sort of old school battle between two different competing organs, which we don't see very often anymore. Now, interestingly, the Richmond Standard still exists. It's the Richmond Richmond. But it rarely goes toward sort of naked partisanship or directly pushing a political agenda. Chevron's kept it probably for public relations, and the truth is they do a lot of nice stories. Not necessarily heavy-duty journalistic work, but they feature people doing nice things in the community. It's become almost like a Chamber of Commerce booster sheet, if you will. But at the time, it was a whole different flavor. And the work that this class and this school did, it changed history, it changed culture, it definitely empowered and engaged a democratic community, the ripples of which are still being felt. And with that, I want to invite you, Andrew, to come on up. Andrew is my intern. He is fantastic, a great researcher. He's also a lifelong university resident, grew up here, knows the community so well, and is a scholar at St. Mary's College. Andrew, take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for the introduction as well. I just want to reintroduce myself. My name is Andrew Hernandez. Like you said, a long time resident of Richmond. I go to St. Mary's College with some political science and sociology as a senior. I guess you guys are wondering, what makes me qualified to be here today? I lived in Richmond my whole life, and I want to come here today to just tell you guys a little bit just about my experiences growing up. Because I think in many ways, you know, the story of someone like myself, Hispanic man growing up in a predominantly Hispanic city, I think it's really indicative of the history of Richmond. It can tell us a little bit about, you know, what we're trying to see, what vision we're trying to have for the future of Richmond as well.
Andrew, I apologize for the sound in this room. It's not ideal. If you wouldn't mind just speaking louder.
Yeah,
that would be
of
great.
course.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So in terms of my story, I really just want to go back to the very beginning of just my family. My family are both from my mom and dad from El Salvador. They lived there their entire life, and you know, it was all fine there. The 80s, there was a civil war. I'm sure you know around that period as well. Many Latin American countries were facing similar civil conflicts. So it was during that period, my parents both were 15 to 16 years old, basically just uprooted their entire lives and fled to America in order to seek a better life. And this is the same for so many other families in El Salvador, you know, a whole bunch of other Latin American countries as well. And so they came into the United States during the 90s, and at the time, I mean, it was a lot easier to get into the United States. Now it's way more difficult for families like mine to be able to have the same opportunities that they did back then. But they found refuge in the Bay Area, right in California. Many Hispanic families started to kind of create a new life for themselves, just all over the East Bay, but specifically Richmond as well. So we saw during the 90s a really big surge of Hispanic population, specifically first generation immigrants, refugees, people seeking support when they came to Richmond. And so I guess my family is just one of those numbers that kind of represent what that period really meant. And so as we look at the history of Richmond, kind of look at what's going on during the 90s, the 80s as well, was, you know, the rest of the country was a large crack epidemic, and that really impacted so many cities throughout the United States, including Richmond as well. And of course, in a city that was already predominantly minority, there was already not many resources being provided for the city in the first place. And so it really just exacerbated so many of the issues. And those issues carried on to what we would see during the 2000s as well. Richmond at the time that I was born in 2002 was really defined by high crime, high violence, no support for families, economically, socially as well. And a lot of that resentment, I think, was really ignored because of the government powers that existed at the time. Robert, you mentioned the story of Chevron, but I think a really important part as well is that a big reason why Chevron is able to kind of maintain such a large control in the city of Richmond was because they have paid off so many of the city council members historically from, I think, like the 80s all the way up until we saw a new progressive movement in the 2000s. During that period, there were so many government loopholes and, you know, different kinds of incentives that were both supporting the city council members at the time and also Chevron. So it was kind of a symbiotic relationship that ultimately negatively impacted families like myself. You know, we didn't have the tax dollars to be able to help support. You know, we had programs or resources to help us, and it was exacerbated even more during the financial crisis in 2008. And just to give you a little bit of just my own background in Richmond, I grew up in East Richmond. My parents came in 2000. And so, you know, they were struggling providing voices from people who actually lived in Richmond and lived their entire lives to uplift the voices of the community rather than just the voices of Chevron. So that movement really started with someone, the woman, her name was Alum. She was a long time activist, and when she moved into Richmond, she saw what was going on with the blighted communities in Richmond, the resource emptiness that existed then, and she was the one who really started this movement that was used at RPA. And so during that period from around I would say like early 2010s, there was a huge push to kind of start bringing in, to bring in people into office that would really represent a newer voice for Richmond, a voice for people like myself. And so that's when we started to see grassroots campaigns, not campaigns that were focused on getting corporate donations from Chevron, but really just going around, just doing door-to-door knocking, calling people, and actually interacting with the community in a meaningful way. And I think during the time that really resonated with so many people in the city of Richmond. And so today, or I guess at that period of 2012, we started to see more and more leaders actually take positions in city council with the RPA as a progressive movement. One thing I want to highlight about the RPA in particular is that it's not a partisan group. So it's not just a group of Democrats. It encapsulates a wide range of different political beliefs. Everyone who's ultimately tied together with a belief in a better future for Richmond. Gail McLaughlin, who I mentioned, who was one of the founding members of the RPA, she was independent. She didn't really tie herself to kind of this Republican versus Democrat kind of duality that we see today, but rather using the RPA as a way to create a movement that wasn't kind of tied to that. So once the RPA began to take power, we really started to see change. And I saw it too, as well. I think a lot of what was going on with the RPA at the time really focused around actually supporting creating programs for the residents of Richmond that were substantial, that were actually focused on creating better lives for our own well-being. That included better community policing programs, better social services in order to kind of help families through the tough times that we saw in the crisis. But I mean, ultimately, though, it was really just about representing people. And I think that was something that was really needed at the time. And it's still going on today. It's so amazing is that the RPA really is just a testament to how important grassroots community organizing is. And that kind of mentality has stayed all the way to today. In fact, it's really exciting that just last year, in November 2002, we saw our first Hispanic mayor enter office in the city of Richmond. And so that has only just revitalized just the passion that we have for the Richmond Progressive Alliance, but also just the passion that we have for one another and our ability to actually inspire change and create a movement. I know in so many cities throughout the United States, the story of Richmond is really like the story of anywhere else. And so, in kind of just trying to explain the story of Richmond and kind of the battle that they had against Chevron, which actually, sorry, I forgot to mention as well, RPA was heavily involved throughout the very beginning in fighting against Chevron and kind of the very corrupt practices that were going on at the time. And so it was with the leadership of the Richmond Progressive Alliance, as over time they were able to gain more and more members. Once they had a majority in city council, they were able to, as you mentioned, really spearhead this new attack on Chevron to ensure that not only were they up to standards to prevent what was going on with the 2012 fire, but also just make sure that they're paying their fair share, that the millions and millions of dollars that they're making through the refinery by polluting our communities are actually giving back to the community, to our people. So that's still going on today, like I said, and I'm very happy to kind of be able to grow up in an environment where our leadership really is tied together by grassroots organizing. And that was a big reason why I wanted to get into politics as well, because I saw firsthand as a child, just how important grassroots organizing can be. And that was something that I really wanted to contribute towards as well. So I'm going to school right now, I'm a senior, I'll be graduating next year, and I hope to kind of use the education and also my life experiences in Richmond to really pave forward a new generation of youth, kind of following the steps of what the RPA created, and then make sure that we're bringing this amazing movement into the future. So I guess with that, that's kind of my story, what we're talking about today. So thank you so much.
amazing. Thanks so much.
Oh, and this book as well. Absolutely amazing. I picked it up last year, and this really gives you such a great detail of what happens in Richmond. This is actually a book written by Gail McLaughlin around the early, mid 2010s, and it really highlights some of the amazing progressive movements that were going on at the time. And it's kind of just like a time capsule for this amazing spark that was created with the Richmond Progressive Alliance. It's like really recommend the book to you guys. It's amazing, especially for those of you who will be working, making stories in the city of Richmond. I think this is a really great place to get your feet wet into the history of what's going on there at the time.
Not many local council members were authors of nonfiction books about local government. That's an interesting read, and certainly you should check that out. So, 3 years after I'm face down on the pavement at Pepito's, while the block is being straight by automatic gunfire, I find myself walking down the dark corridor of the Martinez jail. That's Contra Costa County's central jail facility for men. I get there to the plexiglass, I'm searched by the deputy, I'm brought in, and I see the man standing right there. He puts his fist up against the window for me to respond. And I wonder, what should I do right there? I'm a reporter. I'm here to be objective. I've also been watching a court case for months involving this person. He is not only accused, but now convicted of committing a series of heinous crimes. What should I do? I put my hand down. I allowed myself a minor rebellion, thinking that I could remain objective and I could get him to talk more if I acted like a friend when I first got there. Why was I there? Because in 2009, there was a tremendous crime wave. The shots that day at the corner, that was part of that crime wave. They had apprehended a young man who was accused of being a huge part of that crime wave. What you'll find in Richmond, the police will tell you often, is when there's a massive uptick in homicides or shootings in the city, it's usually just the result of one or two things, of one or two factions of people going back and forth. It's a town that's small enough that that crime rate can be tremendously affected by a small number of people. This person was accused of committing murders all over the city that year. He was convicted of a couple of them. I was there to do that exit interview before they sent him off to state prison. And during the testimony I had watched, they had placed him on that very corner with his cohorts, committing that crime. Fortunately, not a fatality that day, but shooting at a rival at that corner that day. I never told him that. I never told him about our tenuous connection in time and space, but it always lurked in the back of my mind. You can find that it's all Richmond Confidential. His name was Joe Blacknell. His nickname was Fatter, and he's in state prison today. And it's a sad story. You know, this is a boy who had a hard time growing up and saw a lot of tragedy. And that energy, unfortunately, was converted into violent aims. And that's where his life went, and not before he was convicted of taking the lives of several others. When you have gang violence in the city of Richmond, city of Oakland, anywhere else for that matter, those can be good stories, but what's really good about them is not that chase of what happened that day, which our local papers put in the front page every time they get a chance to hit. But part of that is a lack of resources, and they know that their leadership wants to read that. But where you really find the greatest stories of crime is when you go deeper. So I recommend you look into that. That story may not be a crime wave in Richmond in 2023. It may be a crime abatement. It may be helping communities growing up a certain way. Those stories are there for you to tell. And there are many more. You can't step in the same river twice. The city of Richmond is not the same place that it was when I got there in 2009. It won't be the same way tomorrow. But what it is right now today is, in my opinion, the best place to possibly be to practice your craft, to become better journalists, and to make a difference. And don't forget, the work you do here, like the work you'll do in the future, it does make a difference. class used to be conducted solely in the space of these walls 30 years ago. But now you are out there and you are part of the community, and what you do matters. It matters fundamentally. So I wish you the best of luck, move forward, and do well.
We have time for questions.
Yes, let's go. We have 10 minutes. Let's go lightning round. Let's get a whole bunch of questions. I know you got a whole bunch. This is by the way part of the test. Journalists, there you go. You can get them up. And we can tell you, I have a whole portion of my chat that was about story ideas I didn't get into. So that's something you might want to ask about. Anyway, questions. Who's first? Go right ahead.
I'm curious to hear a little bit about transition from being a journalist to then working presumably what I covered previously, the sports supervisor. So talk a little bit about that transition.
Sure. So I was all in. I was loving my job. I was loving journalism. I had been for a long time. I worked at the San Bernardino County Sun and some other papers from roughly 2005, 2009. Then I worked at the Contra Costa Times. After a stint here, both as a lecturer and then at the Ford Foundation as a Ford Foundation reporting fellow. Then I worked at the Contra Costa Times from about 2012 to 2015. During that time, I covered refineries and petroleum industry as well as the city of Richmond. I did a lot of work with a lot of local politicians. And one of them was a county supervisor named John Doyle. And he and I talked a lot, late into the night, many times, always story related. And I always joked with him that if any other politician that I knew at that time would have asked me to come work for them, I would have laughed about it and maybe even turned it into a story. I don't know. But he was different. I admired him. I was very cynical about politics when I was your age. I don't necessarily think that could be bad energy. It was probably bad energy for me. But you definitely want to be skeptical. But, I was always out to get politicians. And that's not necessarily the right way to go all the time. Although, of course, it has to be sometimes. But anyway, during a call about a particular story, he said, I have nobody on my staff. I think you're really talented. I like you a lot. I know we see things eye to eye politically because we had some conversations that had sojourned in other topics. I'd like you to come on for me. And I thought about it, and I had my first son had just been born, his baby. And, journalism, I sort of joke sometimes that, now, it doesn't happen, you can age into it, you can do well. But the way I was doing it, it was definitely a young man's game. I was all to the max all the time. And it would not have been conducive to supporting a young family on my schedule. And so after some soul searching, some talking, I decided to be the best fit for me. And it took some adjusting. That first year was the hard part. The first year, I was in all these meetings that I really wanted to be in as a journalist. I never had gotten invited. I was like, ooh, but I was always in that mindset. Like, look at all these secrets I see, And I wanted to do. I hadn't yet learned judiciousness, right, in terms of using information. And I learned it over time. That doesn't mean lying or dissembling or any of those things. It means using information strategically to advance a goal. What was my goal in journalism? It was simple. It was easy. It was only the truth. I would let the truth be told, though the heavens may fall. I would say something like that, right? The idea is, I don't care how it ends up. My job's still the truth. And I would study the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance. That was one of my lodestars that I think of. It's like, look, the one time those journalists agreed not to tell the truth, and that was a mistake, right? It could have been worse. I'm talking about the Bay of Pigs part. The Bay of Pigs, they helped the administration in hiding, and it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, one could say. So, that's how that transition occurred. It took some time. Absolutely. Now, the last thing I'll say about it is, what's the biggest thing that I do as a graduate? External communications. And I do them all the time. I never lie, but I'm able to use information. We do public service. We do arts and culture. We do breaking news. We do all those things. And we work with our press partners across platforms. So, my storytelling itch is getting scratched all the time. And I really enjoyed that. I don't think I would have had those opportunities 20 years ago. Yes?
Given your position now and that you were the journalist before and wrote
perspective has changed radically. Thank you.
Was it
Yes.
interesting?
And I think that it's better. I don't think that it's worse. I'm trying to be cognizant of it's obviously going to be worse. Right? Thomas Jefferson, before he became president, right, said, if I were to choose a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, right, I would, without question, choose the latter, the newspapers, right? Then, when he's in office, just a few years later, and someone writes him a letter who's starting in a newspaper and says, I want your advice on how to conduct my news business. Jefferson writes back in a letter that's been, memorialized forever, says, I cannot imagine anyone reading anything worthwhile in one of those garbage rags. I can't imagine anything worthwhile in that polluted vehicle. Right? That's the perspective of Jefferson in office and Jefferson as journalist. Right? So I'm cognizant that I want to be that person, but I don't feel that way at all. What I feel like though is, as a journalist, if I had the perspective I have now, I could have been a much better journalist. Because I always started from that position of outrage. This is wrong. Why isn't it better? Force you to reply. And if I don't get a really good terse reply, I was always on this is inexcusable, this is inexcusable, this is inexcusable. And now that I'm in government, I realize good people are working really hard to try to make good things happen. But it's really difficult to do. I talk about homelessness, I think about building housing, right? That's the hardest thing in the world to do. All these hard people are trying to do it here. Think about environmental stewardship, right? All these different issues, it's not nearly as black and white as I used to think it was. So be cautious of that. But, on the other hand, maintain your healthy skepticism. Yes.
How will you deal with the relationship with back?
How did I view my relationship with my sources back then? Yeah. So very much, when I was a journalist, now that story about the fist bump notwithstanding, when I was a journalist, especially early on, I was very straight-ahead journalist, right? I was very against being too friendly. I wanted to be that person. I really romanticized a lot of those old journalistic stories. I wanted them to fear me. I wanted the counsel to shudder when I walked in the door, right? And, maybe that isn't good for me, but I wouldn't do it that way now. I feel like if you can maintain your impartiality, if you can maintain your professionalism, then you get a whole lot more cooperation with honey rather than vinegar. Okay? What I learned in journalism late in my first grade was something that one of my mentors, William Drummond, who's still here, right? William Drummond said in one of our early classes, and it blew me away, I never thought about that at all. He said, in journalism, see, we're not paying anybody for anything unless you're a National Enquirer, right? Or TMZ. We don't get to pay people to participate, right? So in journalism, a huge part of how successful you are in this job is your ability to get people to do what you want them to do. That doesn't mean say what you want them to say, it just means to talk to you, right? And I did reasonably well, but I could have done a lot better. So, to answer your question, I was very unfriendly. I would have been more friendly now if I did it today. And then today, I'm friendly to the max. Like what I'm all about now is I realize the value of cooperation and partnership. And I'm always trying to cultivate it. And I wish I had those skills as a journalist, but I think I could have done better.
We'll have time for Panasha's question. That clock is actually slow, so you could wrap it up. Thank you.
So I actually interned at the state of Minnesota before I came here, and so I was wondering because I kind of, as a journalist and intern at the state of Minnesota at the same time, I kind of got to see the two sides simultaneously, and I was wondering what experience, in your transition, maybe like hostility, because I know other managers in the state building would be very hostile to journalists. Did you experience that?
So, the big answer to your question is very little, especially now, it's been 8 years. But when I first started, within the first few months of my joining Supervisor Joy's office, right, the highest office in county government, I'm right there, I'm his deputy. And less than a year before, I had done an investigation with my colleague David DeBolt, same as UC Berkeley News, an investigation into crime in North Richmond. North Richmond is an unincorporated community surrounded by the city of Richmond. So it is policed by the sheriff. And the thesis of our story basically was, over the years, there have been a whole bunch of all young African American males losing their lives in violence in North Richmond. And the sheriff hasn't caught anybody who's done it. And so it looks like the sheriff's office isn't doing a good job there and may not care so much. That was the implication, right? And then to add to that story, I had looked up the sheriff's records and his calendar, and I could find no instance of him ever visiting North Richmond. Nor could I get anybody who'd ever remembered seeing him in North Richmond. The sheriff's an elected official, and he's a very big, strong, intimidating guy, right? And by the way, we still don't see eye to eye with him. He was very much supportive of like the Trump Sessions Justice Department too, which we had some disagreements over that. But he's a nice guy too at times. Anyway, I walk in the door 2 months in, and the sheriff and his coterie of lieutenants come in. And there's like 4 or 5 of them. They're all dressed in dark suits. They're all big men. They stride through. They're here to meet with Supervisor Joy and I about an issue. It was about building a new jail facility. They come in. We have a big map on the wall. This is the first time he's seen me since I was a journalist, calling his secretary every day, giving her a hard time. And of course, and he wrote a rebuttal to my story in the paper, by the way. Not on the facts, I should say, but on the implications. He walks in the door, he looks at me, and then he looks to his right, and he says, I don't know, Robert. Where's North Richmond? Can you show it to me? Uncomfortable pause for like a few seconds, and then we all break out laughing. Okay, that was a good one. So, in other words, that's a long way of saying that absolutely people are going to have to get used to you in a new role. And if you give them a hard time for a good reason, in this case, I stand by my story, and I think he respects that. He's making a joke at that time. But I think that people will judge you on who you are over time. Especially what I've learned is when you work in public service, not all cultures are the same, not all offices are different. It's a little like journalism. You have a lot of people who are really smart, who might be able to make more money doing something else, but they do something they love to do because they want to. That's most of what I encounter in public service and in journalism. So I'm really proud to have been part of it.